At the end of time, a man from my progeny will be born. His name will be my name, and his middle name will be as my middle name. He will fill the earth with justice and harmony, and his name will be the Mahdi. Al-Qaim will be one of us. He will install terror and fear into the hearts of his enemies. With the help of Allah, he will establish peace, justice, and order. Under his leadership, the earth will unveil itself, so that all hidden treasures will be brought into the light. His kingdom will unite east and west. Allah will place the true religion into the hands of the Mahdi. So tell us the sacred texts of Islam. Many say we are approaching the arrival of the Mahdi, the 12th Imam, the prophesied Redeemer of Islam. It is said about him that his coming will take place in the time when the Dajjal, the false Messiah, will reveal himself. Who is this Dajjal? The respected Islamic scholar Imran Hussein has identified him with Western civilization in general, with globalization, liberalism, and American hegemony. Its manifestation can be seen as well in the racist state of Israel, NATO forces, and Saudi Arabia and its Gulf Cooperation Council allies. The hadith of the prediction in Surah Ar-Rum affirms that the Mahdi will fight against the Dajjal. According to the writings of Imran Hussein, he will fight against the West. In this battle, he will fight alongside Christ and the Christian peoples of Ar-Rum. These two Christians of Ar-Rum are the Orthodox Christian faith. Moscow is the third Rome descended from the Byzantine Empire. Russia is to be the ally of Muslims in the end times, Imran Hussein tells us, whose faith and values are so much closer to theirs than that of the West. The liberal, globalist, American Dajjal is the foe. And here is where it gets interesting. According to Imran Hussein and Islamic eschatology, the coming of Jesus Christ will happen precisely in Syria, in the Umayyad Mosque. Jesus will appear on one of its towers. The hair of Christ will be wet with the sacred chrism, in order that no drop of it should ever touch the ground. Every day the Imam of Damascus places a sacred rug under the tower. In this same Umayyad Mosque in Damascus lies the tomb of Imam Hussein, the son of Imam Ali, a sacred figure for all Muslims, and especially Shiites. At this same mosque rests the head of John the Baptist, cut off by the order of King Herod in response to the dance of Herodias. The Dajjal Western forces are now close to Damascus, where is the sacred mountain Kasum, where it is said that Cain killed Abel in the cave called First Blood. It is an unmistakable sign of Armageddon. US forces and pro-Western Wahhabi heretics are raging against the great shrine of the Islamic world, against Damascus, against the sacred towers of the Umayyad Mosque. It seems they are trying to prevent the second coming. They struggle furiously against the Mahdi and his loyal warriors. When will it happen, you might ask? Right now, before our eyes. Welcome to the end of the world. Damascus is in flames. Dajjal forces are already in the suburbs. Washington recently anointed the sectarian extremists and terrorists as the sole legitimate government of Syria. All the masks have fallen. The final chord of the apocalypse sounds. Syria was a peaceful land for a generation. A beautiful land where dwelled in peace together Muslims, Christians, and other peoples and religions. But it is now in flames. Tortured, violated, slain, dismembered. Syria.
Здравствуйте! Вы смотрите специальный выпуск новостей Глобального революционного альянса. Сегодня мы будем говорить о Сирии, об отчаянной борьбе Башара Асада и верных ему героев, а также о символическом смысле этой решающей битвы и о ее геополитической подоплеке. Битва прозападных сил против законного руководства Сирии является прямым продолжением так называемой «арабской весны», серии кровавых переворотов, восстаний и внутриусобных войн, который Запад развязал весной 2010 года в рамках своей стратегии управления хаосом. В результате арабской весны были ниспровергнуты все политические режимы, которые так или иначе сопротивлялись американскому империализму в регионе. Независимые лидеры были изгнаны или уничтожены. Кровавый хаос, террор и фанатизм захлестнули страны Арабского Востока.
The Arab Spring began in Tunisia and then spread to Egypt. Prior to this, they were ruled by dictators, quite subservient to the West. But this was still not enough for the hegemony. They still clung to tattered fragments of national sovereignty and stability. The West has chosen to open Pandora's box. It has made a bid for its old ally, Wahhabi fundamentalism. These forces have always helped the US to achieve their core interests in the Islamic world, undermining and routing all the tendencies that might be hostile to the US. This was the case in Afghanistan in the 1980s, when the American geopolitician and ideologue Zbigniew Brzezinski personally tutored al-Qaeda leader Osama bin Laden. Pro-American regimes in Saudi Arabia and Qatar, the nest of Wahhabi terrorism, are now playing the role of regional sub-imperialist proxies. The Wahhabi did the dirty work for the US in Tunisia and Egypt, and the most loathsome service was done in Libya, with Gaddafi horrifically murdered. Wahhabi mercenaries under the protection of the direct intervention of NATO have overthrown the Libyan government, and the heroic anti-imperialist colonel was taken from us all. But it is true, imminent justice exists. One moment, we see Gaddafi tortured and killed. But in the next, we see the ambassador and CIA chief of the US in Syria, Chris Stevens, in the same position, raped, tortured, and killed by the same Wahhabi that have murdered Gaddafi. This is the perfect karmic circle. Destiny has reached the guilty. But the correspondences don't end here. In this photo, we are seeing three convivial persons occupied in the Arab Spring. Bernard Henry Levy, French Zionist activist and so-called philosopher, the advisor of Sarkozy and a proponent of Western intervention in all cases where the interests of Israel are endangered by the Islamic awakening. He knows his job very well. He radically is against the Palestinians, but at the same time supports Wahhabis and Islamic fundamentalists everywhere, wherever they serve the West and act as its proxies. In the photo, he friendly discusses with Christopher Stevens on the eve of the overturn of Gaddafi. Both men are radical supporters of the Arab Spring and are deeply involved in the media strategy in favor of the radical Sunnis, as well as in the supply of weapons, training, and political support. But who is this third? This is quite amazing. He is Gil Herzog, the producer of the Islamophobe American film The Innocence of Muslims. So we have two supporters of radical Islam. One, an American CIA agent. The other, a French anti-Palestinian Zionist. Together in friendly discussion with the Islamophobic hater and sponsor of this heinous film. Very, very strange. But the most incredible part of this story is the pretext of the killing of Christopher Stevens. It is precisely this film, The Innocence of Muslims, produced in the USA and sponsored by Gil Herzog, that was the pretext for Stevens' death. This is a symbolic map of the Arab Spring. The CIA and Zionists, with the Islamophobes, use and manipulate the Sunni fundamentalists via Saudi Arabia and Qatar in order to prevent a real Islamic awakening. The Islamic world strategy opposed to the US and the racist state of Israel. This is the real face of the Dajjal. Where is Bernard Henry Levy now? In Syria, supporting the enemies of the Syrian government and its president, Bashar Assad, blaming Iran, Russia, and Syria, while consolidating European opinion against the Syrian government. This vermin has not yet met his end and scuttles about doing his dirty work. The other traitor of Islamic solidarity in the Arab Spring is Turkey. Prime Minister Recep Erdogan, as once he did during the Cold War, returned to the Slavish pro-American Atlanticist strategy for the state of Turkey. This is readily obvious now. By the order of the CIA, he mounted the Ergenekon case, destroying the military group of the Kemalist Eurasianist politicians who wanted to save and reaffirm the freedom and independence of the Turkish Republic in a new multipolar world. In the minds of the USA and Israel, the ultimate goal of the Arab Spring is to target Iran, the main opponent of the US in the Islamic world, which continues to lead an uncompromising war against American hegemony. However, Syria stands in this path to the invasion of Iran.
Вот так тесно оказались увязаны между собой геополитика, религия и эсхатология. Атака на Сирию как стратегический подход к вторжению в Иран, но вместе с тем, как наступление последнего этапа эсхатологической драмы. Кроме геополитики и религии, большое значение имеет и фактор нефти. О петрополитике нам расскажет в своей рубрике «Стратегемы» постоянный ведущий GRA News Леонид Савин.
Что бы ни говорили о причинах конфликта в Сирии, есть один существенный момент, связанный с петрополитикой и интересами глобального капитала. Сейчас мы проанализируем сложившуюся ситуацию, оставив в стороне тактику партизанской войны, технологии пропаганды через социальные сети и религиозную подоплеку. Расклад региональных сил, которые являются важными игроками в энергетической политике, таков, что на одной стороне находятся Иран и Ирак, на другой – Катар и Саудовская Аравия. Сирия – это связующее звено в возможных инфраструктурных проектах региона, и трубопроводные магистрали могли бы связать регион Ближнего и Среднего Востока с Западной Европой. Географический детерминизм указывает, что это государство находится в более выгодной позиции, чем Турция, через которую пролег нефтепровод Баку-Тбилиси-Джейхан. Далее на севере начинается Южный Кавказ, входящий в зону интересов и контроля Российской Федерации. Следовательно, Сирия – это единственный альтернативный вариант в качестве государства-транзитера. Помимо того, что в Сирии также есть нефтеносные участки, важность географического положения своей страны прекрасно понимало ее руководство. В 2009 году Башар Асад заявил о принятии стратегии четырех морей, которая была направлена на трансформацию страны в региональный узел поставок нефти между Персидским заливом, а также Черным, Каспийским, Средиземноморскими морями. В 2010 году был подписан меморандум с Ираком, который предусматривал строительство 2 нефтепроводов и 1 газопровода для перекачки этих энергоносителей из иракских месторождений Аккас и Киркук на побережье Средиземного моря. В июле 2011 года иранские чиновники заявили о сделке стоимостью в $10 миллиардов между Ираном, Сирией и Ираком, предусматривавшей создание газопровода из самого большого газового месторождения в мире Южный Парс в Сирию. При этом предусматривалось расширение существующего трубопровода AGP, который связывает Египет с Ливаном, Иорданией и Сирией, по линии Алеппо-Килис на юге Турции, что в дальнейшем могло послужить причиной интеграции с планом Набуко или альтернативным вариантом по переброске газа из Турции в Европу. Наличие в одной команде таких игроков явно противоречило идеям Вашингтона по манипуляции энергопотоками в Европу, и разрушить такие планы могли бы серьезные форс-мажорные обстоятельства. В начале 2011 года в Сирии уже прошли первые демонстрации, и идея создания хаоса, который бы предотвратил реализацию стратегии четырех морей, тут же была поддержана Западом с участием региональных держав. Одной из таких держав является Турция, которая пошла против собственной стратегии не иметь проблем с соседями. Второй – карликовое государство Катар, верно служащее интересам США и Британии. Если у Турции, которая зависит от российских и иракских энергоносителей, с точки зрения евразийской стратегии, был неминуемо выгоден союз с Сирией, существует зависимость от Запада через блок НАТО, то Катар узрел прямую выгоду из разрушения возможного энергетического альянса. Ранее Катар сам предлагал Сирии провести трубопровод для перекачки газа в Европу, однако получил отказ. Чувство мести нашло хорошую почву в арабской весне. Расценивая перспективные доходы от газовых поставок в Европу и найдя там поддержку со стороны параноидальных политиков, обеспокоенных монополией «Газпромом» в Европе, Катар начал активно поддерживать широкий фронт оппозиции. Политической аморфной структуры под названием Переходный национальный совет, джихадистов-террористов, многие из которых слабо понимают, где и против кого они воюют, а также ряд неправительственных организаций. Учитывая возможности инструментов мягкой силы, Катар вместе с Госдепартаментом США начал финансировать и различные религиозные организации и центры, в частности, связанные с суфийской традицией и мистическим исламом в целом. Например, шейх Абдаль-Кадир, относящийся к последователям учения Ад-Даркави и проживающий в Кейптауне, установил связи с Катаром и Объединенными Арабскими Эмиратами, получая оттуда финансовую поддержку. Центр ордена Накшбандия на Кипре также был втянут в проамериканскую авантюру. Шейх Назим Аль-Хаккани установил связи с Госдепартаментом США и пропагандировал угрозу со стороны России, вымышленном им самим сценарии вторжения в Турцию и освобождения впоследствии Стамбула с помощью англо-американских войск. Кроме того, в графе расходов Катара миллионные контракты на покупку оружия США. Вряд ли это карликовое государство собралось защищаться от соседней Саудовской Аравии, Бахрейна и Объединенных Арабских Эмиратов, являющихся послушными сателлитами США. Вероятнее, что это делается по подсказке Пентагона для гипотетической защиты от Ирана, который вряд ли собирается конфликтовать со странами на другой стороне Персидского залива. Иран, как важный союзник России и следующая мишень Запада, не является случайным. Таковы перипетии ближневосточной геополитики. Будьте бдительны.
События в Сирии начались в 2011 году. Запад был уверен, что в этой стране довольно быстро повторится ливийский сценарий, и проамериканские экстремистские силы быстро снесут правительство Башара Асада и погрузят страну в кровавый хаос. Но этим планам не суждено было сбыться. В ходе арабской весны стало очевидно, что Запад играет по двойным стандартам. Если политический режим ориентирован на США, как, например, в Бахрейне, то Вашингтон и его марионетки поддерживают его и безжалостно подавляют восставших. Если, напротив, политическая власть ориентирована антиамерикански, то Запад вооружает и поддерживает террористов. О двойных стандартах и о циничной логике НАТО нам расскажет в своей рубрике известный радиоведущий, американский аналитик Тим Керби.
The pretext to any of NATO's actions throughout the world is democracy, freedom, or some other cute buzzword. Going around the world shoving your culture's ideology down everyone else's throat on a liberal crusade is bad enough, but fighting this crusade in an openly hypocritical way is another thing entirely. Syria has become the trendy humanitarian crisis of 2012. This is a story we've heard before. Iraq, Libya, Serbia, even that Coney 2012 thing. Some group of people somewhere is under the yoke of brutal tyranny, so they need to be saved by being murdered by NATO bombs. But let's play a bit of a game. Let's assume for the sake of argument that all the allegations from NATO are totally true, and because Assad is a bad guy, the West has the right to invade and or at least fight him via proxy forces, killing the local population until they're free. Then why is Syria so alone in the crosshairs when many of its neighbors are far from shining examples of democracy? Luckily, I recently had to do a bit of research on the lovely island of Bahrain, where they round up people for tweeting about the king. Yes, arrests for what you say over stupid Twitter. The king, a monarch, has recently banned protests and demonstrations of any sort and has arrested opposition leaders. If this happened in certain countries, Russia, there would be media outrage. But since Bahrain bribes CNN so well, everything gets smoothed over. And since 2011, they have also had a curfew for everyone, as in you can't go outside of your house at night if the government doesn't allow you to. And what about Saudi Arabia, a country that has rampant gender segregation and on occasion actually puts witches on trial in the 21st century? But on the other hand, maybe witch trials are actually a step forward for Saudi Arabia because they are not usually known for actually giving people a trial or charges at all. The thing is that there are blatant examples of countries that don't meet Western standards that somehow get ignored, swept under the carpet. Again, not all countries have to meet Western standards. I'm not arguing for Western standards. What I'm trying to say is that with the size of the CIA and MI6, there is no possibility that they don't know what goes on in these countries. It is a conscious choice to focus attention on one trendy target at a time. Whether conspiracy or not, sadly the mainstream media follows these trends, ultimately allowing absurd military actions to be undertaken and justified. Let me take this in another direction. Think about this situation from a common man's perspective. Even if the allegations against Assad's government were true, if you lived in Syria, would you rather live under a stable dictatorship having to deal with, say, censorship and government corruption, or live under a NATO bombardment watching your children die in shrapnel or fight like rats for the last scraps of food in the rubble, for a possible chance that maybe somehow this anarchic revolution will bring about a bright future that is completely unguaranteed? Especially considering the fact that the revolutionaries are far more brutal, murderous, and fanatical than anything you've seen from Assad. If you were an average Syrian, would you ever take the risk of supporting these rebels and allowing NATO to bomb you? You wouldn't. You would never, ever, ever do that. End of story.
Постепенно стало полностью очевидным, что целью американцев является противопоставление суннитов и шиитов при поддержке радикальных суннитских фундаменталистов. Шиитская дуга на Ближнем Востоке от Ирана, главной цели американских стратегов, через Ирак, Сирию, вплоть до Ливана с его Хизбаллой. Вот настоящий враг Даджала. Исламские лидеры во всем мусульманском мире все отчетливее стали понимать реальные планы США и их израильских марионеток. Откровеннее всего описывает ситуацию ведущий исламский авторитет, духовный лидер шейх Имран Хусейн.
It is in this scenario that we now want to introduce how Dajjal is going to exploit the Sunni Shia division to his advantage in Akhir Zaman. The answer is he wants to provoke Sunni Shia civil war. That's what he wants to provoke. If he can succeed in provoking Sunni Shia civil war in the world of Islam, what would be the benefit for him and for the Zionists? Number one, Islam is going to look terrible before the entire world on the stage of the world. Look at these Muslims at a time when they are back to the wall, fighting for their very lives. Look at how foolish the Muslims are fighting amongst themselves. Islam is going to look so bad that whatever sentiment there may be in the world sympathetic towards Muslims, even that might be lost. And that will be tremendously advantageous to Israel and to the Zionists and to their propaganda war in CNN and Al Jazeera and the newspapers and the television. Number two, Dajjal will consider it advantageous to provoke a Sunni Shia war, because such a war will weaken both the Sunni and the Shia at a time when Sunni and Shia should be trying to build maximum strength and power to resist Israel and to resist the Zionists. Thirdly, Sunni Shia civil war is going to break up Pakistan. There's no way that Pakistan can survive. They are the ones who planned 9/11. And one of the reasons why they planned 9/11 is to be able to get a base in Afghanistan from which to target Pakistan, to attack Pakistan, to destroy Pakistan's nuclear plants and nuclear weapons. But there's a fourth reason. Iran is the Shia country, par excellence. The revolution in Iran has produced a government which has consistently for these last 25 years opposed the Zionists. That's not what they want. Dajjal doesn't want that. Sunni Shia civil war in Islam, in my opinion, is going to facilitate the effort for regime change in Iran. The fourth hadith from Sahih Muslim tells us something more, that before Constantinople can be conquered, a Muslim army emerging from the south, Medina is south, would have to first defeat Rome in order to be able to go on to conquer Constantinople. And that the army of Rome would be an army in which women also serve. We're getting interesting now. Who is Rome? When we go to the Quran, we get one answer very clear. Rome is the Byzantine, Eastern Christian Empire, which used to have its headquarters in Constantinople. And after Constantinople was conquered by the Ottomans, the capital of Rome went to Russia, Moscow. But in the same way that a Russian army is not going to stand between Medina and Constantinople to protect Constantinople, because Moscow has never had any alliance. The Russians have never had any alliance with Constantinople to protect it. Well, then who are those who have an alliance with Constantinople and will stand in the way to protect Constantinople? Answer: it is the Western Christian Rome. And so it is the Zionist NATO Rome that we'll have to fight and defeat in order to get to Constantinople. Constantinople is not under Muslim control. Constantinople is under the control of NATO, and therefore under the control of the Zionists. And that is how we can understand that the Muslim army would have to liberate it. The Turkish government could do what they want. They can't stop it. Nabi Muhammad ﷺ is more powerful than the Turkish Prime Minister. When the conquest of Constantinople takes place, after defeating Rome, which is Rome of the West, the implication is that since the Prophet said, ﷺ, you're going to make an alliance with Rome, meaning Rome of the East, but the Russian Navy, because now aerial warfare no more, the Russian Navy will now have free passage through the Bosphorus. If you look on the map, please show the Bosphorus big so they'll see the small strip of water, that small strip of water between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean Sea, so that the Russian Navy could enter into the Mediterranean Sea, and that will turn the balance of power, naval power, in the Mediterranean, and make it a more equal and even-handed fight, which eventually will lead to the destruction of the Zionist state of Israel. The Russian government knows that the Syrian regime cannot survive. It doesn't have religious legitimacy. It doesn't have moral legitimacy. No. It has been an oppressive regime. Oh yes. And so you will have to have a transition to something else. The Russians know that. The answer to the problem now is for the Syrian Muslims to recognize that Putin has given to them an opportunity. And I don't want to speak too much, I have to be guarded in my language. And that is that you must understand who are your enemy. After this lecture you will understand that Nabi Muhammad alayhi salatu wasalam has prophesied an alliance with Rome, not Rome of the West, Rome of the East. And so you have to make a distinction, a division now. All those in Syria who remain opposed to Zionism and the Zionist state of Israel and the Anglo-American Zionist Alliance and NATO, and all those who are in opposition to NATO, whether you are pro-Assad or anti-Assad, it doesn't matter. You must all now come together in a constitutional conference and work out an agreement for you to come together as one body to oppose these who have come in with Saudi money and Saudi arms and Qatari money and Qatari arms and Turkish money and Turkish arms to fight on NATO's behalf and to fight on behalf of the state of Israel to bring about a regime change in Syria as you did in Libya.
Картина ясна. Геополитика переплелась с признаками последних времен. И в этом сценарии участвуют, как мы видим, не только одни мусульмане. Кульминационной стадии достигает Великая война континентов, потому что за Ираном, который является главной мишенью для американского империализма и саудовско-катарского субимпериализма, стоит Россия. Не только потому, что в Сирии расположена российская база, но и потому, что за Ираном следующие мы. Позиции великих держав относительно Сирии прокомментирует постоянно ведущий рубрики «Dissent», политический аналитик и специалист по международным отношениям Марк Слебода.
This is another type of war, new in its intensity, ancient in its origin. War by guerrillas, subversives, insurgents, assassins. War by ambush and stealth instead of by combat. By infiltration instead of aggression. Seeking victory by eroding and exhausting the enemy instead of engaging him. It is a form of warfare uniquely adapted to what has been strangely called wars of liberation, to undermine the efforts of new and poor countries to maintain the freedom that they have finally achieved. It preys on economic unrest and ethnic conflicts. U.S. President John F. Kennedy in 1962. This quote can be found at the opening of the U.S. military's 2010 Unconventional Warfare Manual. These few lines illustrate what is now a core American foreign policy and military belief that U.S. forces have the right to meddle, destabilize, infiltrate, assassinate, and subvert around the world, all in the pursuit of the U.S.'s geopolitical and hegemonic foreign policy objectives, without consideration of what the people of those countries actually desire, and in complete violation of the United Nations Charter's founding principles, which form the basis of all international law, of the inviolability of state sovereignty and guaranteeing non-interference in their domestic affairs. Most characteristic and nefarious of unconventional warfare as practiced by the U.S. over the last decade is the proactive and aggressive effort to mimetically and psychologically turn a population against its own government. The Unconventional Warfare Manual goes on to say, the intent of U.S. unconventional warfare efforts is to exploit a hostile psychological vulnerabilities by developing and sustaining resistance forces to accomplish U.S. strategic objectives. For the foreseeable future, U.S. forces will predominantly engage in irregular warfare operations. The Unconventional Warfare Manual is dated 2010. Ethnic and religious divides are two of the most common and easiest such vulnerabilities to exploit in states that the U.S. has decided constitute an enemy, or simply stand in the way of U.S. foreign policy objectives. States such as Syria. President Obama, echoed by other Western leaders and government spokesmen, has spoken ad nauseum in the last year and a half of and in the name of the Syrian people. On February 4th, 2012, he said, "The United States and our international partners support the Syrian people in achieving their aspirations and will continue to assist the Syrian people toward that goal." And more recently, on the 12th of December of 2012, he apparently decided for the Syrian people that "We have made a decision that the Syrian opposition coalition is now inclusive enough, is reflective and representative enough of the Syrian population, that we consider them the legitimate representative of the Syrian people." He was speaking of the Syrian National Coalition, formerly known as the Syrian National Council, the newly rebranded, corralled and herded, reformulated and repackaged, squabbling, ragtag and disparate pack of exiles and oligarchs living in London, Paris, and the U.S., that the Western powers and their dictatorial allies in the Gulf Cooperation Council intend to install in Syria. Regardless of the fact of the loud and very vehement rejection of the Syrian National Coalition's authority and legitimacy by the jihadists and Sunni sectarians who are actually fighting on the ground to overthrow the government of Syria. The narrative of the Syrian conflict that the Western governments and mainstream media would like to peddle to us paints a simple, easy to understand, black and white, good guy and bad guy, Manichaean fable of a continuation of the Arab Spring. A heroic and liberal Syrian people fighting for their freedom and democracy, who are being brutally repressed and killed by their own tyrannical dictatorial regime, personified and demonized in Bashar al-Assad. The truth, of course, is far more complex, far more nuanced, and far more morally gray. Obviously, at this, there is a significant portion of the Syrian population in rebellion against the Syrian government. It is also obvious that these rebels within Syria and without, native Syrians and foreign jihadists alike, are not unified or cooperative in act, purpose, or motivation other than in the removal of the current government. By designating the al-Nusra Front, those at the forefront of all the rebels' military gains over the last year, a terrorist organization, on the very same day he declared the Syrian National Coalition to be the sole legitimate representative of the Syrian people. The Obama regime intended, at least symbolically, to address the concerns of many allies, and at home, that the opposition contained Islamist and al-Qaeda affiliated elements. By playing the bad apple card and designating sub-rebels as good, supposedly Western aspiring, freedom and democracy loving liberal rebels, and other rebels as the bad Islamist rebels that we would desperately love to pretend don't exist. This symbolic and disingenuous effort was completely negated and shown as the sleight of hand it is, as over 30 opposition groups, fighting brigades, and civilian committees in Syria immediately pledged their allegiance to the terrorist group, saying, "We are all Jabhat al-Nusra," and condemning the United States. Even the West's pet exile government, already painfully aware that few in Syria share the U.S.'s anointment of them, urged the U.S. to reconsider designating al-Nusra as a terrorist organization, openly saying that religion, in al-Nusra's case Wahhabism, was a legitimate motivation for trying to violently overthrow the Syrian government. But other than the squabbling and fractious rebels, it is also obvious that some of the Syrian people still support the current government. Otherwise, after a year and a half of terrorism and guerrilla warfare, funded and armed by the Gulf Cooperation Council dictatorships and the West, it surely would have fallen. Opinion polls and elections have shown that it is perhaps a majority of the Syrian people that still support the current government. These have been ignored by the West. So the key dilemma becomes which Syrian people, and how many of them, are the Syrian people that Obama is attempting to speak of and for, and which Syrian people, and how many of them, are loyal to the government. And it is the answer to this dilemma that will lead us back to the U.S.'s unconventional warfare strategy of overthrowing unwanted governments, like Syria, by cynically exploiting existing ethnic and religious vulnerabilities. Syria is a country with an extremely complex diversity of ethnic and religious identities. Syria's modern borders were drawn up by Western powers under the guise of the French Mandate, which oversaw the dismantling of the Ottoman Empire at the end of World War I, and hoped to add Syria as a colony to the then French Empire. Within Syria's borders, like most countries outside of Western Europe, lie not one ethnically homogeneous population to fit the mold demanded of the European ideology of nationalism, where the borders of a state should be congruous with one ethnicity, whose political unity and cohesive identity give it legitimacy. Indeed, even in Europe, these nation-states only came about after hundreds of years of fratricidal and genocidal warfare and the imposition of the social institutions of modernity. It is this formulation of an ethnically homogeneous nation-state which is so vital to the formation of the modern state and the Western model of liberal democracy. Instead, Syria is characterized by ethnic and religious pluralism. The tensions of this pluralism were held together under the Ba'athist government that emerged as Syria won its independence from French domination by the formation of a fairly fragile, secular, multi-confessional, multi-ethnic, and effectively one-party republic under a promoted pan-Arab nationalism. Syria's 26 million population is composed of approximately 60% Sunnis, 15% Alawites, a minority Shia sect, 10% Christians, 12% Kurds, 3% Druze, and the rest divided among small populations of Turkmen, Shias, Circassians, Jews, and others. Approximately 75% of Syrians are ethnic Arabs, but the ethnic and religious identities crisscross and overlap. However, even these numbers are contested. The real percentage of non-Sunni minorities may be greater in proportion to the population. Also, even this is a simplification, as the Sunni Arabs are divided into strong geographic, regional, and tribal identities, as well as by strength of religious devotion, ranging from the secular to the Wahhabist. The Christians can be broken down into 11 main sects, including the Greek Orthodox, Melkite, Syrian, Maronite, Chaldean, Armenian, and Catholic denominations. The Syrian Kurds, meanwhile, are split among two politically divided groups. One that is supported and aligned with the Iraqi Kurds, supported by the United States, and the second group of Kurds that confront the Iraqi-aligned Kurds, the PKK, and through extension is in alignment against the United States. The Alawite sect has remained loyal to the government of Bashar al-Assad since the conflict has begun, because they stand to lose power completely and possibly the ethnic cleansing of the entire population from the area. The government of Syria has long been dominated by the Alawites through the Assad clan. This has not always been easy to maintain, as in the early 80s, Hafez Assad, Bashar's father, had to put down a very similar uprising by the Muslim Brotherhood, which killed over 30,000 people. The West at the time tacitly looked away and remained silent, in complicit approval of the act. The U.S. has had a hand in the instigation and exacerbation of this round of ethnic tensions in Syria for almost a decade now. U.S. General Wesley Clark spoke openly and with worry over a decade ago about plans in Washington to overthrow several Middle Eastern governments formerly aligned with the Soviet Union, and what they viewed as a 10 to 15-year window to accomplish this before the recovering geopolitical strength of Russia and China would make it impossible. This list included Iran, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Libya, and Sudan. From the list, we can clearly see that it is only Syria and Iran that have yet to be intervened in by the United States and its Western allies. Seymour Hersh, the Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, wrote in the pages of The New Yorker in 2005 about U.S. operations to support Islamist groups in Syria in order to weaken and hasten the end of the regime. CNN covered a story just a short time before the unrest in Syria began, a year and a half ago, about U.S. and British funding for opposition radio stations and political parties, which caused the Obama regime to issue a statement that they were definitely not acting towards regime change in Syria, just promoting their peculiar form of democracy, which they saw as their right and duty. The narrative of the start of the Syrian conflict is one of peaceful protesters repressed by a brutal regime. But this is not at all clear from the timeline events. The beginning protests were all marked by episodes of violence. The arson, the destruction of government property, and attacks on police officers. These would be tolerated in no Western country, and would be responded to with violence to the protesters that initiated them. The initial deaths could not be directly attributed, even by the protesters, to the government forces. This was all just assumed. These shadowy shooters, whoever they were the ones who instigated the conflict. Not even the most propagandistic and mendacious of supporters of regime change in Syria would deny that the Syrian revolution has been, from the beginning, a Sunni revolution, with a few token politicians in the Syrian exile groups promoted by the West, which provide a veneer of multi-ethnicity and multi-confessionality to try to make this Sunni revolution appeal to all of the Syrian people. As these violent protests turn to outright rebellions and warfare, the conflict has become only increasingly more sectarian and religious in nature. The Syrian government was previously looked on with ambivalence or a sentiment and desire for change by many of the Syrian minorities outside of the minority-ruling Alawite sect. But since then, they have become to be seen as the guarantor of the safety of minorities because of the sectarian nature of the rebels, who have taken to calling for jihad. But the truth is that only an urban bourgeois minority of protesters were ever liberal in the Western sense and fighting for freedom and democracy. Much as in the case of Egypt and Libya, the liberals themselves, the Western mainstream media, and the Western governments mistake who the people of these countries really are outside of their own urban bourgeois minorities. This is a clear case of projectionism. The majority of the populations of Libya, Egypt, and Syria, particularly the rural populations, are extremely religious and conservative, represented politically best by the Muslim Brotherhood and affiliated Islamist groups, who are now taking advantage of the opening created by a minority of liberal protesters to overthrow the government and install a caliphate under Sharia law. Since the conflict has reached the current stage, the Christians have begun to side firmly with the government of Bashar al-Assad. They bear noting that over 600,000 Iraqi Christians fled the liberation of Iraq by United States forces and the civil war that followed to safety in Syria. Many of those, along with their Syrian native Christian cousins, are now fleeing the country to Europe, Turkey, and elsewhere from the mobs of Sunni Islamists in the streets. The chilling chant heard echoing through the streets of areas taken by the rebels. Alawites to the grave, Christians to Beirut. The Patriarch of Syria has spoken out frequently and often about what is happening, but has only been ignored by the Western governments. Even the New York Times has been forced to admit that what the Christian population is facing by the rebels is outright ethnic cleansing. The Kurdish minority originally tried to maintain a state of neutrality in the conflict. However, about 6 months ago, Bashar al-Assad shrewdly granted them complete autonomy over the Kurdish majority areas in eastern Syria and withdrew all military forces. Since then, there have been a number of rebel Islamist attacks on the Kurdish areas. This has forced the combating Kurdish political forces to join forces with the government against the rebels. The Druze have attempted to remain neutral throughout the conflict, and as they only represent a very small portion of the population, they have fairly well managed to do so. But in the last few months, we have seen a spat of suicide bombings in Damascus and Aleppo in Druze majority areas that are turning the Druze towards the government and against the rebels. Despite assurances by the West, the minorities of Syria know best who the rebels actually are. They know who is fighting against the government and what they face if the government falls: ethnic cleansing and pogroms. This brings us to the geopolitical dimension. All the players among the so-called Friends of Syria and the actual friends of the Syrian government have their separate objectives and motivations. Turkey has long had a close relationship and a policy of no problems with its neighbors. It was a supporter of the Assad government, attempting a rapprochement with the West prior to the most recent unrest. However, they have since completely reversed course, and many view their stance as one of looking to a collapse of the Syrian government as a chance for an Ottoman restoration. Lebanon is a beleaguered country, split between a Shiite Hezbollah faction and the government, which is more secular and Sunni. The Lebanese government is the one most likely to be inflamed with the unrest from Syria spreading through to its borders. Iraq is now dominated by a Shiite government since the U.S. liberation of the country from the Ba'athist regime of Saddam Hussein. This might be seen as the single greatest fiasco in American foreign policy. What it has created is an arc of Iranian or Shiite influence from Iran through Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon to the Mediterranean. Bahrain, a member of the Gulf Cooperation Council, has a Sunni minority ruling class that rules over a majority Shia population through much brutality and repression. They fear this arc, as does Saudi Arabia, which has a sizable Shia minority, particularly in the heavily oil-producing areas. Iran is firmly allied with Syria, with the Syrian government, and with the government of Bashar al-Assad. They know very well that if Syria falls, not only will their own influence in the region be diminished, but that they will be next on the chopping block for regime change by the Western powers. Saudi Arabia has long been a foe of Iran in the region. They view themselves as a potential deputy hegemon for the United States. As such, they have long sought to combat Shiite and Iranian influence throughout the region. They would love to see the Syrian government fall. The European Union would like to see the Syrian government fall, as it would secure the continuity of the entire Mediterranean with governments in alignment with European foreign policy objectives. While Syria is not a major oil producer, in just the last few years, large oil and gas deposits have been found in the eastern Mediterranean off the coast of Syria and Israel. This would go a long way towards combating the energy security paranoia that the European Union has. Russia has long been an ally of the Syrian government. This dates back to the Soviet Union. Russia has supplied the Syrian government with arms, and the Syrian government in return has provided Russia with a naval base. Neither of these reasons should, however, be seen as paramount reasons for Russia to continue supporting the Syrian government in the current circumstances, because this naval base in Tartus amounts to nothing more than a rusting pier, and Russia has forgiven several $billion worth of arms sales to Syria in the past few years and continues to sell arms to Syria on credit, not a profitable venture. Israel, of course, long threatened by Syria on one side and Egypt on the other in their precarious position in the Arab world, along with Syrian support for Hamas and Hezbollah, would dearly like to see the Syrian government fall. The U.S. primary interests are maintaining its hegemony over the region and ending this Shia crescent of influence that they themselves created via an earlier intervention in Iraq. This geopolitical analysis, along with the ethnic analysis of the conflict in Syria, presents us with several useful dichotomies for analysis, beyond the good Syrian people versus the evil regime that has been presented to us as the dominant narrative. We can see, in foreign policy terms, the Syrian conflict as a proxy war between Saudi Arabia and Iran. We can see it likewise as a proxy war of sorts between the US on one side and Russia, and to a lesser extent China on the other. This is largely over the issue of sovereignty and the world order. We can see this conflict as a conflict of the Muslim Brotherhood versus secularists, not only in Syria, but throughout the Arab world. We can see this within Syria as a conflict between urban and rural populations. We can see this as a conflict between an Alawite minority seeking to maintain power and a Sunni majority that would like to install its own Islamic influenced form of government over the country. Similarly, we can see this as a conflict between Shia and Sunni, not only in Syria, but throughout the Islamic world. This is perhaps the threat of the greatest danger to the region and risks an inflaming that could spread to Lebanon, Iraq, Turkey, and beyond. The U.S. knows all of this. They have known it for a long time. They first remarked on the connections with al-Qaeda in the very beginning of the ethnic unrest. They know who and what the rebels are and what they want. They know of the danger to the region. They have just decided to sacrifice the Syrian people and perhaps the wider Middle East region on the altar of ethnic and religious hatred and conflict for their own geopolitical objectives and machinations.
В ситуации с Ливией мы пережили тяжелый момент, по сути повторение Горбачевско-Ельцинских времен. Исполнявший тогда обязанности президента Дмитрий Медведев практически сдал американцам Каддафи. Сегодня ситуация иная. Во главе России стоит Путин, и позиции Москвы качественно отличаются. Больше никаких сомнений относительно реальных целей американцев. Это решающая фаза войны. Войны не просто против наших друзей и союзников, войны против нас.
From the very beginning of the Syrian conflict, Moscow has taken an unequivocal position. It is Syria's sovereign and internal affair, and no external intervention is tolerable or legal under real and existing international law and the United Nations Charter. Russia has not only discouraged the possibility of intervention, but has unequivocally spoken and voted against it. at the United Nations Security Council, using its veto to block a Western resolution to legitimize their aggression. China has held to the same position as Russia. So two geopolitical camps have formed around the Syrian conflict. And the one camp are those against any intervention and the supporters of the UN Charter, state sovereignty, and the emergence of a multipolar world: Russia, China, and Iran. And in the other camp, sectarian and extremist forces dedicated to the overthrow of the secular Syrian state, supported by the hegemon, the United States, along with its European lapdogs, Israel, and their allies in the Islamic world: Turkey, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the other despotisms of the Gulf Cooperation Council. Putin has firmly warned Turkish Prime Minister Erdogan that the direct intervention of Turkish troops in Syria would not be tolerated. This would justify NATO intervention under Article 5 of the NATO Charter, as Turkey is a NATO member. The CIA has reported that they expect the Syrian government to fall to the jihadists and Sunni sectarians within several weeks. The truth of this forecast, predicated on their own actions inside Syria, remains to be seen. In anticipation of this, the U.S. has recognized a fractious rabble of exiles and extremist leaders that they themselves finally herded together as the sole legitimate government of Syria, the National Coalition of Syria, to an extent that they never did with respect to the rebels in Libya. Thus, they have signed Bashar Assad's death warrant, along with the death of tens to hundreds of thousands of Syrians who also refuse to accept the murder of their country, which they love and are willing to defend to the last drop of blood. Two camps, two global blocs, two armies. All positions are clearly defined and marked. This time, Russia won't flinch and back down as it did in Libya under Medvedev. The political climate in Moscow has changed, but this strong will in the defense of sovereignty and international law doesn't ensure a happy end to the Syrian conflict.
В Сирии решается судьба мироустройства. Будет ли мир однополярным или многополярным? И вместе с тем еще более глубокая проблема. Кто победит? Даджал-антихрист или Махди и верные Христу? Силы Махди представлены традиционным исламом и шиизмом. Христианами в такой ситуации можно назвать только Россию. Цивилизация Запада давно уже христианской не является. Нам недолго осталось ждать развязки. Мы вступили в финальную битву за смысл мировой истории. Враг наносит по Сирии смертельный удар. Бои идут за кварталы Дамаска. Но если мы сейчас не остановим их там, далее они двинутся на Иран. Антироссийские силы поднимаются на Северном Кавказе, где салафитское подполье пристально следит за развитием событий в Сирии. Падение Асада будет для них знаком к началу восстания. И снова Запад найдет способ их поддержать. А это значит не что иное, как начало Третьей Кавказской войны. Многие после того, что случилось в Ливии, все поняли и больше не испытывают иллюзий относительно того времени, в котором мы живем. Теперь ясно, пощады не будет. Либо человечество остановит американско-израильского даджала Антихриста, либо мы прочно попадем под его пету. Но многие, увы, все еще спят. Пока кровь льется где-то там, сотнями тысяч гибнут старики, женщины и дети. Пока это не у нас. Но кольцо врага рода человеческого стягивается все туже и туже. С каждой минутой сапог натовского оккупанта и его подручного салафитского головореза все ближе и ближе к твоему дому. Все агрессивнее и циничнее произраильское лобби лжет обществом и народом всего мира, представляя агрессоров жертвами, а борцов за правду врагами цивилизации. Война давно уже ведется внутри наших границ. Война за наши сердца, души, мозги, тела. Все очень и очень серьезно. Глобальный революционный альянс объявляет мобилизацию. Нас атакуют в каждой точке мира, и отпор мы должны давать повсюду. Пусть пробужденных мало, но на нашей стороне Бог. Сегодня Каин в предместьях Дамаска снова готовится убить Авеля. Сегодня орды Гогов и Магогов атакуют наши святыни. Каждый вправе выбрать свой окоп. Но никто не сможет сказать позднее, что вас не предупреждали. Дамаск – это и есть последнее предупреждение. Дорога в Дамаск – это дорога нашей души. За веру и истину надо сражаться, не щадя никого. ни себя, ни других. Иначе нас просто перережут, как скот, мясники глобализации и выпустят кровь. Башар Асад – знамя глобальной революции. Дамаск – наш универсальный вселенский пароль. Всего доброго. Вы смотрели специальный выпуск новостей Глобального революционного альянса. До встречи на поле боя.